Good evening, everyone. I think we would like to start our program for the night. My name is Suhair Wastawi, and I'm the Dean of Libraries at Florida Institute of Technology. On behalf of everybody in the library as well as Florida Tech, we welcome you tonight, and I'm so happy to see many of you, many of our authors, as well as our friends from the community here tonight. First, I want to say that it's true that I'm the dean, but I didn't do any of that work. It's all done by Cassie Turner, and I really thank her dearly for all the work she has done to put this night together. So, Cassie, thank you very much for. So, Cassie asked me to talk about reading, and I'm not sure exactly what to say about reading. Whatever I would say would sound quite biased. First, because I'm a librarian, and second, because I am much, much more of a biased reader. So it is definitely all of you here because of reading, because how important reading is for you and your family. I recently read an article about how prison management decide on the size of a prison and how many cells would be in a prison. And they depend on their statistics or design based on how many children at the time, age 10 to 11, that cannot read. So it doesn't mean that every very well-developed society doesn't have criminals, it does, but there is quite a correlation between lack of education and lack of reading and crime. So words are important, they will always be important, but they are more important now as we navigate the world, as we connect with other people over all different types of ways. Literacy is more important than ever, especially in this time we are trying to produce global citizens as we try at FIT, who can read comfortably, comprehend what they are reading, and understand the nuance and make themselves understood. Books are the way we communicate with the dead as well. The way that we learn lessons from those who are no longer with us, that humanity had built on itself, progressed, made knowledge incremental rather than something that has to be relearned over and over. There are tales that are older than most countries, tales that have long outlasted the cultures and the buildings in which they were first told. We can be in a technical institution and not talk about Albert Einstein. So what did Albert Einstein say when he was asked how to make children more intelligent or intelligent? His reply was actually both simple and wise. He said, if you want children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. And if you want them to be more intelligent, read more fairy tales. He understood the value of reading and of imagination. I hope we give our young in our families and the world and our students here a word which they are able to read and to enjoy the reading, to imagine, and to understand how the world works around them. I think that all comes through reading, and again, I'm a biased librarian and a reader, so I appreciate you being here today, and I think we would like to start the program, but I would like to give the word to Cassie first.
Thank you, Suhair. Dr. Wastawi has just been at Florida Tech for about a year and a half, am I right? And she is making things happen. Our outreach to the community is definitely one of those, so I'm delighted that you all are here. What better reason for the campus community and the local community to get together than about an evening of readings? I fully intended to brag when I got up here that I was the most excited person in the room to have everybody here and to have these awesome readers here. But I take that back. I saw reunions going on over in that lobby that I think were a long time coming. This is very exciting. The connections that have been made, the reconnections that have been made tonight are absolutely delightful. to me, and I hope to you all. I hope you're enjoying this already. Little bit of housekeeping to begin with. The restrooms in this library on the first floor are right down that hall. If there are any food items or drink items left, when we break for the book sales and signing, feel free to enjoy them. And the other thing that I would say is everybody comfortable? Can everybody hear me? Raise your hand if you're not one of those things. Okay, so you're comfortable? Okay, good. I got it from the back of the room. I do want to tell you all that Weona Cleveland, some of you are probably here because you thought you were going to actually get a chance to visit with Weona. She's ill, so she wasn't able to join us tonight. But we still will hear from her book. So any questions, anybody need to jump up and move? Is there anything that needs to happen before we begin? Okay, you're set. I hope that some of you were able to watch the 2-minute video that really leads into our first reader. Joni Holzer-Sherm is an accomplished, passionate, superb writer, as you can see in your program. Let's just take a look at the program a little bit. She had a full career in an engineering firm. She did and has done a number of things, great writing, great segue into her storytelling, all of which began when both of her parents died within days of each other, and she began to explore these red Chinese boxes that she and her siblings had seen over time. Excuse me. Her book, Adventurers Against Their Will, has won a number of awards, and you can see that in your program as well. And I don't know if any of you had a chance to hear her interview on WFIT this week, but it will also be archived there, so you might get a chance to do that if you've not. One of the things that you may not know is that Joni Sherm won international attention for her volunteer leadership role in bringing the FIFA World Cup Soccer 1994 to Orlando. And for some people, that was the most significant event of her life. So now let's hear from the daughter of the late Dr. Oswald Holzer, the namesake of our Holzer Health Center, Joni Holzer-Sherm.
Thank you very much. This is such an honor to be here. It's an honor to be with these authors that are here. I'm amazed that I'm here. And my brother wanted me to give a message to one of them, Marcia Denius. They grew up together, and I told my brother who lives in Palo Alto that I was going to be with her, and he said to tell you that he now knows why you were always picked #1 before him in softball, because you were faster. That's my important message for the night. I want to thank Kathy Turner and Ann Sepri for all the work that they did. And we had a wonderful lunch today with others to get caught up on lots of stories. But I'm particularly proud that I'm here because my father did start the Holzer Health Center, and it meant so much to him and so much to our family. So it's a great honor to be here today. I want to do a shout out to a few people that are here today. Some had a great friendship with my father, and they also interfaced through their FIT days. Patty Miller Dell, whose late husband John Miller was the vice president of academic affairs, they were great friends of my father and mother, and Patty's here. Pete and Lenore Zeiss were also great friends, and Pete was well known in our family because he stepped up as the head of the first Friends of the Garden here, Botanical Garden, so that meant a lot. So thank you for coming. And then 2 women that worked in my father's office that showed up, and we were talking about reunion, or she was mentioning reunions, which Rita LaBelle and Susie Crane. And I remember them growing up and what they meant to my dad. And another person who wanted to be here tonight but couldn't be here is Sue Barge, and she was my dad's nurse, a nurse for 7 years. And then she came out here and worked at his at the health center when it started up for several years. So that was also just a huge thing. So anyway, it means a lot to be here. And then I have 2 bestie friends here, Stephanie Sawyer Rubin and Nina Rothschild Saunier, who came tonight to see me, so that's fun too. Now, the story that I have written, Adventures Against Their Will, is a backstory to my father's life. And I have to give you a little bit of context before I read to you from the book. So my father was born in the Kingdom of Bohemia when it was Austria-Hungary. And he grew up when he was just 7 years old, it became Czechoslovakia. And he was in the Czech army as a young army doctor when the Nazis arrived and occupied his homeland. And he was of Jewish heritage, knew he was in danger, and managed to go to a place in the world that had a free and open port, only because the Japanese had taken it from the Chinese, and that was Shanghai. And he went to Shanghai and thought that he would be able to practice medicine, but there were a lot of other refugees from Europe that were doctors, and he couldn't find any patients. So unlike a lot of refugees that went to Shanghai, he went to the interior of China, the great interior of China, Shanxi province. And he worked for an American Brethren hospital as a doctor there. And one day he took a train into Beijing, then called Peking, and he was stranded there because of the warfare that escalated there. And he ended up meeting and falling immediately in love with a woman who was born in China of American missionaries, and that woman was to become my mother. They were married 60 years. I have a brother, Tom, and a sister, Patty, and we spent the last 48 years here in Melbourne. So that's the background, the backdrop for my book, Adventures Against Their Will. So when you see the book out on the table, that's my father in the middle there. So I'm going to read from the prologue first. The red Chinese boxes loomed just out of reach throughout my childhood. Those fanciful sword-fighting figures painted in luminous lacquer against a backdrop of lush trees and towering mountains beckoned. But my brother, sister, and I paid no attention. The twin boxes were part of our familiar to the point of being invisible landscape, like that big tree outside your window with a botanical name you never learn. It's just the big tree, and those were just the Chinese boxes. One of us might have been tempted to climb the bookshelf to get to those boxes if they'd stood out as much as they might have in most American homes in the 1950s, but our house was packed with art objects from around the world. China was the dominant theme. Chinese paintings, Chinese calligraphy, Chinese sculpture, and books about China were everywhere. When I was small, I used to imagine the Yangtze River flowing past our house, not Florida's tranquil Indian River lagoon. We even said a prayer in Chinese before meals. China was the leitmotif of our family life. It was where my parents, a young Czech doctor and the daughter of American missionaries, met in 1940, fell in love, and married before moving to America, where they died within 2 days of each other in January 2000. After their memorial service, my brother, sister, and I lovingly sorted through their possessions. Among the many treasures of travel and friends and family was a particular red lacquered Chinese box. Its contents transformed me. For 60 years, my dad had kept 400 letters inside that box, as well as other hiding places. They held the voices of 78 writers from World War II who carried on a conversation with him that reached around the world: China, Czechoslovakia, Ecuador, America, France, England, documenting the horrors and hopes of a time and place that most of us can't even imagine. I made it my mission to unravel the stories, the truths in the letters. With the fervor of an archaeologist, I needed to satisfy my curiosity about my father's correspondence. For my investigation into their lives, I traveled the globe, both virtually and physically. Many leads took me in the wrong direction, but I persisted. Revealing these histories and their meanings became my obsession. Some of the letters were mundane, plenty were humorous, and several were profound. It took only a few accounts from within a forced labor camp or a concentration camp for my journey to grow emotionally difficult as I encountered intimate descriptions of the pain, loss, and arbitrary cruelty of the Holocaust. But there was joy, too. These were real people living their lives as best they could in extraordinary circumstances. So in the midst of it all, outsmarting the Gestapo, crossing oceans laced with exploding mines, facing armed Japanese soldiers, or enduring disease and hunger, there was humor and love. I learned that the poetry of everyday life endures despite the circumstances. I hope that you will find these adventures against their will as interesting and important as I do. This book is a companion volume to My Dear Boy, The Discovery of a Lifetime, which chronicles my father's journey from Prague to China to America. Adventures Against Their Will is based on the letters of my father's close friends and cousins. Karel and Frante Schoenbaum, Karel Bala Ballenberger, Hanno Winternitz, Pavel Kraus, Rudla Fischer, and Vlada Wagner. These people mattered, and their stories have universal relevance. I am forever indebted to my father for the gift he left behind. He taught me that life is all about the messages you receive along the way and what you do with them. One of the places that they gathered before they left, these 7 people that were friends and relatives, as I said, and 5 of them escaped, like my father, to different continents around the world, and 6 of them were Jewish. And they gathered before as college students, like you would around here at maybe the hot dog place. They gathered at a place called Manish Cafe. And so I'll read you something one of the writers, Vlada Wagner, had written later in life, and my father had saved it, and it described a little bit of that circumstance. We seemed a very normal bunch, an independent-minded student group that met in a coffee house, had a lot to talk about, and sometimes even fell in love. Really, this would not be sufficient reason to take pen into hand if the neighboring country Nazism had not broken out and many of us were branded by our race. We did not like politics, and we were adverse to it. We preferred to speak about art. We talked about all sorts of things, and only sometimes from blurted out comments, it became clear that what happens in our neighboring country is not at all immaterial to us. It really weighed on us as the subject of an unavoidable thunderstorm. I love all my characters, so this was really hard to choose out of them to read something. And then I decided that really I wanted you to know my father a little bit more. So in putting together my book, the book is about going in search of the 7 friends and finding them alive, which I found 2, or their descendants all over the world. And so I chronicle kind of that journey and what I found out. But remember, the only thing I knew starting out was what was the content in their letters. So the letters play a part of it as excerpts in it, and you meet them. The great thing about my father's letter collection is that he actually typed on carbon paper, with carbon paper, when he was in the middle of China, in the middle of nowhere. He typed letters and saved some of them, and he saved 70 of them. And so I got to know my young father through those letters and what he was feeling, and he was pouring his heart out. So this I'm going to read you is from Frante Schoenbaum. Swept up in a maelstrom of war and genocide, my father's generation lost more than most of us can fathom. But Karel's brother, Frante Schoenbaum, didn't lose his sense of humor. One of the first letters I read from the collection was from Frante. Writing from Prague just after the war on December 1st, 1945, he summed up the devastation of his homeland and his people. It was pretty. I think it is best depicted by this joke. 3 Hebrews meet in 1938, and one says he is going to Brazil, the other is going to Canada, the third says he is staying home. The 2 others nod their heads and say, "Yes, you were always such an adventurer." The joke wasn't original. By the way, obviously, Frante is the one that stayed behind, or was trapped behind. The joke wasn't original, but it was typical of Frante's dry and inexhaustible wit. As I learned when the long process of translating and studying the letters finally reached the point where I could figure out Frante's unique place in the puzzle, that was my father's life. Because of the sheer volume of letters, I divided them among 5 different translators. As a result, I didn't receive the English versions in chronological order or sorted by author. Reading them was like listening to the random voices of strangers, one after another, as if flipping among radio stations. To bring sense to the process, I created a large database that captured not only details, dates, locations, and relationships, but also every name mentioned in each letter. The list eventually totaled more than 300 names. At first, these souls were strangers, but after 2 years, I knew them all and how they were connected. Like Karel, Frante Schoenbaum shared both Benešov, which is where my dad was born, roots, and family friendship with my father's kin. Karel was born in 1906. The only girl, Anka, followed in 1908. Then came Frante in 1910 and Honza in 1913. Frante was 5 years older than my father. I suspect that helps explain why their letters seemed more playful, even rowdy, a tone than the others Dad exchanged with Karel. It is also clear that Waldeck, who is what my father went by, and Franta enjoyed the traditional earthy Czech male sense of humor, often referencing various body parts to make an off-color joke, no matter how desperate their situation was. Waldeck and Franta wrote with enduring hope, believing that a better day would come, even when they faced horrors and atrocities. Unlike Karel and Anka, Franta and his younger brother Honza stayed behind in Czechoslovakia during the German occupation, experiencing a grim and tenuous existence that makes Franta's good humor all more remarkable. As I read through the entire collection of letters, Franta and his wife Andela became my favorite characters in my father's wartime dialogue. Franta was one of the first people my father heard from when he reached the exotic Chinese port of Shanghai, and their close friendship enriched all their letters. One sent by my father from Shanghai on July 20th, 1939 to Franta in southern Bohemia was apparently a reply to a letter that had been lost. It included an uncharacteristically detailed account of my father's life. So this is how I get to know my dad, when he just had reached China and he was in Shanghai. If some of you are in a bad way, perhaps come here. It is better here, despite all the misery, than in Prague or in Europe in general. Especially one can work here. And I will be already sitting somewhere with a medical practice by that time, so I could help you. One would not stay here forever, but it's somewhat easier to get to other countries from here. You have no idea how happy you made me with that letter of yours. You know, when a man does not hear that dialect of ours anymore, at least he can have something enjoyable to read again. To tell you the truth, the distance is not so big, and it does not seem so huge. But I am damn homesick for everyone and everything, particularly when a man is almost totally without news and when he does not know when and if all he will return. Such thoughts develop in your head only after some time. Do not be angry with me that I am responding to your cheerful letter with such sentimental blabbering, but they call it Shanghai Depression here, and supposedly everybody goes through it during the initial phase. After all, you know that is not my nature. And for all of you who knew my dad, that is truly not his nature to be down. I hope that in your literary hellhole, you will also mention the good physician Oswald Holzer, who left his mother country to treat poor little Chinese. In order for you to elaborate on this topic better, I am sending you the following contribution. So already for 3 days, I have been partially palmated by malaria. I caught it somewhere in Saigon, stupid French Indochina, but it is better than tuberculosis. Hey, one must always be content. I am curing it by myself, chiefly with whiskey, which is dreadfully cheap here. I don't know, Sue and Rita, did he ever prescribe that? Otherwise, it is possible to catch in this beautiful but crappy country everything from measles to leprosy. Hey, so that I won't forget, if you happen by any chance to talk with my family, do not tell them anything about these nice things. They would be unnecessarily worried. It is not so bad. In a week here, you set aside all European social prejudices. You let yourself ride in a rickshaw. You are cursing the Chinese, in Czech, of course, and you start to booze. In short, you become a white shadow. It is somehow a matter of course situation. Franta, there are 20,000 immigrants here, 98% of them without money. So the society gave them housing in a quarter completely destroyed by Japanese bombardment, from which the Chinese fled. And those Jews, Israelites, etc., built their homes from those ruins, opened businesses, coffee houses, even Jewish prostitutes are here. But of course, you cannot guarantee them that the bombing in the area won't start up again tomorrow. Those who do not trust in that place and have a little money live in the French concession, which is above all safe. Like in a circus created for adventurers, you can make so much money here in a day that you don't need to do anything else in life ever. And in an hour, you can have it all flushed down the toilet. The dollar dropped yesterday and today by 30%, which has been talked about here for a week already. So a number of people became rich, and others lost their shirts in the process. Even the weather is crazy. I went out nicely in the morning in a white suit with a towel around my neck, as it is a fashion here, in order to have something for wiping when one is sweating like a pig. I sat on a bus and started moving. However, a typhoon struck, and I managed to get off the bus only with extreme difficulty. Then I ran in the street until I fabulously fell. For a while, I rolled in the mud, and then when I looked around, I discovered that numerous gentlemen were doing the same thing, having a good time in the mess. So I had a good time, too. Every so often, some gentleman crawled over me with the necessary sorry. Then, all of a sudden, there was a loud sound next to me. A roof had fallen. I don't know from where, because none of the surrounding houses had roofs. Under the roof lay some rickshaws and an overturned car. Therefore, I told myself again, safety first, and I slithered with the crowd into the nearest alleyway, where I waited for 6 hours until the typhoon ended. One can no longer distinguish what the Japanese destroyed and what was the typhoon. For me, as a physician, there are some possibilities here. I have a number of acquaintances, and I feel that I will not get lost. However, I don't want to stay here as a lack of a feeling of home. When I make some money, I will rush immediately further inland. Otherwise, you can manage to live beautifully here with 77 pounds a week. You are a big gentleman. You can furnish a luxury apartment for 5 pounds, and for 1 Shanghai dollar, you can have a beautiful gal for a week with everything. There's a little bit more, but anyway. So he ends it with, P.S., write on airmail paper, you naive man. To whom are you paying postage? There was like an international postage that you could do for less. Do I have any more time? I wanted to tell one little story. You tell me if I'm... One little thing. Okay. This is just an amazing story. This whole journey, so many amazing things happen. I can't even tell you all of them, but one is extremely interesting. One of my father's first cousins, her name was Hanna Winternitz, and she's one of the chapters, and I did a lot to find her relatives, and I ended up with a daughter who sent me a memoir that was very helpful and gave me a lot of other information. And then she gave me 6 names out of her mother's address book that were in America, and she thought they might be of interest to me. Well, I looked through them, and at the time I didn't recognize, any that went with anything I was doing, and I remember I had 300 names and lots of people and a lot of letters, so I kind of just put it aside. And when I was finishing the chapter on Hanna, I realized that one of the ladies that she had sent me, it said Eva Gould, and Hanna had mentioned a best friend named Eva Pawlowska. And I thought, I'll take a chance. So I Googled Eva Gould, and it showed a California address, or a California city, and I Googled it, and up came a $7 million house for sale in Los Angeles, and it was one of those realtor things. You can walk around this dramatic house, and see it, but there was no mention of her, and so I thought, I didn't know what to do, so I thought I'll just mail her a letter, and I'll send her copies of Hanna, her best friend from youth's letters, and I'll ask her if she knew my dad. And I sent it, and didn't think anything more. And I put my business card in there with my email, and 1 week later I get this letter, or I get an email. Dear Joni, this past Saturday I received your letter addressed to my mother at the San Marino, California address. My mother did indeed go by Pawlowski and grew up in Prague, leaving for America in 1939. It is the most remarkable thing that your letter reached me. My mother, Eva, passed away 2 years ago last month, but she and my father had moved from the San Marino address in 2003. I had become friends with the current residents of our former family home in San Marino. They are moving to Oregon next month, so I stopped by to say goodbye, and believe it or not, the postman delivered your letter while I was there. How's that? Thank you. I do hope that you'll consider the book, and I hope that you'll look for My Dear Boy, which I mentioned earlier, because that's my father's story, and it's not out, it's not done yet, I'm still writing on it, but it's going to be an amazing story, because that one letter shows you a little bit of my dad's life, and multiply that by 100. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you for tonight.
When that book comes out, we'll have another evening, and in order to find out about it, you will want to make sure you are on our email distribution list. The sign-up sheet for that is back there on the table where the handouts are, so please be sure to sign up so I can be in touch in the future. Up next is Jody Murray. His interesting life has taken him from the Air Force Academy on a European adventure to corporate America in an online banking company, to writing and poetry in academia, and now to us as an American Council on Education called ACE Fellow. So we're just delighted that he's here this year at Florida Tech with us. He draws upon many facets of his research, which is very broad-based, in order to get his inspiration. So let's hear some poetry from Dr. Jody Murray.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again, and I appreciate Evans Library for this wonderful, hospitable event. Anytime that we can be talking about writing and anytime that we can be talking about the lives, the interior lives of a reader, I think is good time well spent. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. Every time I've given a reading, I have been pulled between two poles. One is, as a person who has sat through many poetry readings, a feeling of, oh, please just get on with it and read the darn poems, and one hand, and on the other hand, this feeling of, okay, you're just hitting me with poem after poem, and I have no idea what's going on, and I feel completely, flamboozled by the whole thing. So I don't know if I have a good mix of that, but I'm going to try, because I do want to stay within my 10 minutes. In fact, I'm going to set my alarm. I can talk a little bit about my own poetry. For those of you who are interested in poetry, any closeted poets out there? Go ahead and raise your hand, man. Why not? Oh, come on. Oh, I don't believe that for a minute. There we are. There's a few more that's coming up. Good. Yeah, I mean, one thing about being a poet is it can feel very, very solitary, and it isn't. There's more poetry being published and written today than ever in America, and poetry is thriving. But as Wallace Stevens once said, the only people who buy poetry books are poets. So, one of the things that I like to do is talk about the different styles of poetry, but also to think about just where I might see myself fitting in the whole pantheon of poetry. And clearly, I'm an imagistic poet. I'm a person who likes to work in the lyrical realm. If none of this makes sense to you, that's okay. I don't tend to tell stories in my poetry, with few exceptions, so that's something that's a little different for some people. They like to hear a story, but I don't tell stories generally. So the poetry itself it relies on the emotional moment, really, and that's how it drives whatever there could possibly be in it. So I'm going to read from two manuscripts. The first is called Anaphora. Anaphora is a rhetorical figure. Perhaps you know it from, say, MLK's I Have a Dream speech, where he says, I have a dream, and then he gives you some information. I have a dream, he gives you some information. So anaphora is that repeating figure, and so the poems are all entitled. There's 80 of them, and they work on the same idea over and over again, like an anaphora would. And I'm only going to read a couple. They also have a strange form. I like to give readings where I can project the poem so you can see what the lines look like, because part of what we do as poets is to actually craft the poems on a page, and so you can see how the line breaks work. But lacking that, I'm just going to read the poems and give you some little bit of information in between. To stand sweating, alone, on a rock before you, for you, is tender and stupid. What we do in such places is meet our belonging like the sand meets itself, a stranger of itself, carved of itself, lasting, minute. I place petals from my pockets on your dark eyelashes, and in this stillness no wind moves them. You throw off your dress, run to the sea, and disappear like a minnow, blind from its own chrome-plated skin. I know you swim well, that the sand has 1,000 eyes, but in case the ocean loves its guests, I follow. None think night is empty, that only insects repeat songs and anxieties through loss. Truth is, curtains over earth have holes in them. Brightness is everywhere. What is it you would like to take across the strobe of space? Elders take nothing, and they hear rivers tuned to the same frequency as the sun. You would do well to think what thrives in the night under the multi-eyed stare of heaven? Would you carry such a heavy body so far every night? I could stand completely still as you wipe your answers across my lips with honey. The other manuscript I'm going to read from is called Voices in Residence, and the poems are in this manuscript are all focused around sort of suburban living, and I've had a lot of suburban living in my life where you tend to be sort of separated as a satellite kind of way from the rest of an urban population. So it's about the two voices sort of rattling around in a house and talking about the trivias of that everyday kind of living. This poem's called Natural Measure. 1. From knuckle to wrist there is distance, and between us, further than rimmed skirts flung into sideways grins or heaped dishes or trash or many of the daily silences, between this distance we align like iron filings. What magic is measure? We can only know what exactly. It is only through imaging distance that we guess at meaning. More than an arm or a finger outstretched, or the distance from the corner of one eye to the other, we occupy spaces. 2. Sand has no need for measure. Each touches each all around until the planet wears its dusty coat. We are so distant so often, or we are a planet embracing too hard its own moon. Sorrows in Miniature. How much work burning must do in silence against its own desire, consume everything as if it is its own sorrow, no matter how small, a bead of water about to adopt one side of the glass, to commit, surrender. Small sorrows are like this, unable to hear their own burning, too infrequent to instruct us to change. One of the problems I have as a poet, and this is myself only, is that I think that the latest thing I've written is the most interesting thing I've written, which is never true. It's usually the thing that needs the most work, actually. But also, you get kind of used to the older work, and so you're always more interested in the stuff that you're writing right now. I'm sure a lot of the writers in this room feel something that's very similar. So the rest of the poems are newer poems, and I would like to just emphasize how I'm moving towards a manuscript that is a little bit more naturalistic, a little bit more towards looking outward towards nature and sound. So some of these poems reflect that interest. And I should say, for those of you who have no knowledge of music whatsoever, music often has at least two different clefs, treble clef and bass clef. Bass clef is often used by bass instruments, and so the title of the poem is Bass Clef Swelter. What I see in chords wallowing in the belly of a cello, horsefly-sized chords, fat with blood, is the history of staying power. The stream existence carries behind as heavy, as networked, as homely and welcome as an unset pecan pie. That chord stays a while. That chord crushes, not cuts, sinks, not soars. Palms and other palms sweat to know it. The next poem derives from a common symbol that I'm sure you've seen in any medical establishment, at least in the past, and that is the rod of Asclepius. Asclepius was the god of health in Greek pantheon, and one of the things that you'll notice by the rod of Asclepius, it's a rod with a snake that sort of swirls up, and a lot of the medical institutions use a version of that. It's not the exact same thing for their symbols. And so I really was sort of fascinated by the history of that particular symbol. And it turns out that in various old-time hospital-like places in Greece, they would use a non-venomous snake as a way of symbolically referring to health. In fact, the non-venomous snake would just roam freely There were hundreds of them. And they would sort of just slither over on top of patients and in and out of rooms and all over the place. And they were considered a model of health or a symbol of renewal because they would shed their skin when they were old. And they would seemingly be eternal. And so that kind of symbol has become part of the symbol of health. So this poem is sort of derived from that knowledge. Rod of Asclepius. Careful stepping here as the snakes roam freely and sometimes pause just to trip you up. Rats rarely show themselves here. Buckets of accordion skins stocked in corners, stocked in time for plagues. Rebirth every morning, an aid here to help you get to the other side, keep you standing. In the dark whispers and patient eyes of new miracles, none stay long, either way. I don't write a lot of biographical poems that refer to specific points in my life. I grew up in Colorado, and in very rural Colorado, so this poem comes from those few instances, called Colorado Dawn. We celebrated and thought tight thoughts about breakfast, about breaking bowls with fortified vitamins, extra D, and splashes of white C. But we were wrong to think the morning gray light was anything but weeds in wind, becoming thrilled, nothing further ahead than to remember to be quiet, to chew closed-mouthed. Outside, a deer rocked upside down in the shed my father kept off limits, sometimes even to deer. Hair thickened by pasty blood stuck to our tongues and smelled of warm hamburger and washed dog. In passing, the sun forced its way through cracks in boards taller than the fence, and I could see dark eyes inside, calm, pulsing with flies, ripening. And lest you think I'm without any humor, the last poem for tonight. You know, poets and humor are actually, it's very difficult to write a humorous poem. Just as it's very difficult to write a love poem and not sound like every other love poem that's out there. So it isn't something that I would say I do well. But at least there is some sense of humor in some of this poem. And I will close tonight with this poem. Thank you very much. It's called Armpit Love. 19 reasons this spring to love armpits. 19 songs of tears and revisions to broth, less onion, more celery still. Tourists in chicken cannot know the chicken. Microbes vibrating their way in and out of life, waving microbe jelly at the community they've built. Lava tubes an ocean away, pool, cool water, deeper, and gush single-mindedly from mouths lined with love colonies of superbacteria in the dark red glow. I'm working on myself, but I'm not ready. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Ben Brotemarkle, who has distinguished himself with an impressive batch of accomplishments on paper, on film, on radio. Okay, you all will read in the biographical sketches that Ben Brotemarkle is the executive director of the Florida Historical Society. He has an academic career as well and is quite an accomplished author. I'm happy to tell you that regarding his radio show, he chose to interview individuals here at Florida Tech. That was Florida Frontiers Radio Show number 186, if you want to catch it, when he was learning about our Vision Extraordinaire, the History of Florida Institute of Technology exhibition, when it debuted last year. So, welcome, Ben.
I want to share, since it's Black History Month, a brief passage from a book I wrote about 10 years ago. It's called Crossing Division Street, An Oral History of the African American Community in Orlando. And I spent about a decade conducting oral histories in the Paramore neighborhood of Orlando. And in a lot of ways, it's a fascinating, unique community, but in many other ways, it reflects trends in other similar communities throughout the South particularly and across the country. So while it focuses on the Paramore neighborhood, it also provides the book looks at a broader context, statewide, regionally, and nationally as well, at a lot of the issues that face this particular community. Part of what I did too was there's a chapter called Friends and Neighbors that looks at people who came through Orlando frequently, who didn't live in that community. And I thought since we're here in Brevard County and it's Black History Month, I would focus on a part of a passage about our Brevard County's own Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore. So this is part of their story. Oh, by the way, too, obviously, story. What gives this book real substance are the dozens of people that I talked to over the course of that decade, and I'm really very pleased that I was able to record their memories because the majority of the people I spoke with are now passed away. So many of them were in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and including poet and performing artist Maya Angelou and many others as well, the jazz drummer David Panama Francis, and a lot of other folks. But this passage is about Harry T. Moore. In addition to inspiring students, Moore became very active in trying to improve the quality of life for Black people in Central Florida. He joined the NAACP, eventually becoming director of the Florida State Branch, and diligently worked for integration of schools, improved voting rights, and equal treatment for Blacks in the legal system. Although a soft-spoken man, Moore was very vocal about his views, speaking frequently at Black churches throughout the area, writing letters to political leaders, both Black and white, and challenging those he thought were perpetuating racial injustice. Moore formed the Florida Progressive Voters League and registered 116,000 Black citizens to vote between 1944 and 1950. In a letter to that organization dated November 15, 1945, Moore encouraged change on a local level, saying, "All of these evils can be traced directly to the prejudiced attitude of local officials." Evangeline Moore, his daughter, remembers working with her father on his NAACP projects when she was just a child. I do remember a lot of NAACP work with my dad from the time I was able to understand what was going on, and I remember that I helped him a lot with his mailing lists. We had a one-hand operated ditto machine. He usually typed out the stencil and he ran off whatever material he wanted to send out to the NAACP branches. I remember also, I guess I was either 12 or 13, my dad was not a very forceful speaker, and he, at the time, began writing his speeches for the Florida State Conference conventions. I would commit them to memory, and I would have to deliver them. I also remember having nightmares a few nights before my appearance, and in the dreams, I would always be standing right up front, and nothing came out. I just froze. But I finally got over it, and I delivered some speeches until I was 16, when I went to Bethune-Cookman College as a freshman. Frank Williams was born in Titusville on January 1st, 1925. When Williams was a boy, Moore inspired him to work for racial equality, particularly in the public school system. After graduating from high school, Williams attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, where he was 1 year behind Martin Luther King Jr. The two served on the Morehouse Student Council together. Williams went on to earn his Doctor of Education degree from the University of Florida. After working as a teacher and school principal, following in the footsteps of Moore, Williams spent 8 years in Washington, D.C., helping to desegregate public school systems efficiently and effectively under Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Carter. Later, Williams served as the National Director of Volunteers in Service to America, VISTA, and Director of the Peace Corps for Africa. He also worked briefly for the Department of Education before returning to Central Florida to teach at Brevard Community College before retiring. Williams remembers the influence that Harry T. Moore had on his life. When I was in the junior high school here, the black school, Harry T. Moore was the principal, and I first encountered him. And when I got in high school, he was the principal briefly, and I knew him and his daughters. And of course, the county got rid of him because he was a member of the NAACP, and the NAACP was for unitary school systems. And he became state director of the NAACP. And he knew all of us, and I knew his daughters well, and so forth. He would talk with me from time to time about bringing about a unitary school system and trying to bring about integration. He did his best to get me to serve as the first deputy sheriff in Brevard County, integrating that. And of course, I just told him that was not my forte, and I could just not do it. I wasn't cut out for that. But we were always friends, and we talked from time to time, and I supported the NAACP, and in many instances, he talked with me about various things. As a matter of fact, we had what we called the Black State Educational Association, and it was not integrated at the time, and he would meet and speak to that group, and of course, he knew me from the time he was my principal when I was in junior high and on up, and we continued to be friends. The Ku Klux Klan was very active in Florida in 1951, participating in a number of bombings, cross-burnings, physical assaults on blacks, and other acts of violence. The KKK was aware of Moore's activities, and its members were displeased. In October 1951, the president of the Mims Citrus Exchange, who was a known Klansman, threatened the life of Harry T. Moore. On Christmas night 1951, Moore and his wife were killed when a bomb planted under their bedroom exploded at 10:20 p.m. Following his murder, the FBI learned that the previous July, 2 white men had stopped at a black-owned store in Mims and obtained directions to Moore's home. One of the men was identified as Orange County Klansman Earl J. Brooklyn, who had shown a floor plan of Moore's home at a KKK meeting in Apopka. The other man fit the description of a former exalted cyclops of the Orlando Clavern of the KKK named Tillman H. Belvin. Another suspect in the bombing of the Moore's home was Joe N. Cox, who was running for Orange County Supervisor of Elections, but committed suicide one day after his second interview with the FBI investigators who were questioning him about Moore's murder. Another Klansman named Cindy Hopper reportedly bragged about casing the Moore home and suggested using dynamite to blow it up. To date, no one has been formally charged with the killings of Harry T. and his wife Harriet. When the bomb exploded under the Moore home, the sound ripped through the quiet winter night. People in Titusville, 4 miles away, heard the blast. Those closer to the blast were rudely awakened by the sound. Within minutes, friends and neighbors were spreading the dreadful news that Moore's home had been destroyed. Frank Williams remembers that night clearly. I was in the public school system then. I was a teacher, and I was at E.L. Thomas, who was my principal. I was at his house, and we were playing cards. We were having kind of a party, being that time of the year during the Christmas holidays, and we had a party there, and we were playing cards and so forth and so on. Many people don't believe it, but we heard that explosion in Titusville that occurred out there in Mims. During that time, I think you could hear noises better without interstate highway traffic and other distractions, and somebody called, I think it was his brother-in-law from Mims, and he called and asked if we knew that his house had been bombed and that they had rushed him and his wife to the doctor in Sanford. But of course, he was already dead, and his wife died over there shortly thereafter. We were all shocked and hurt, and it kind of broke up the party, and we went home. Moore's daughter Evangeline moved to Washington, D.C. in August of 1951 to take a temporary job with the United States Postal Service. She planned to work for a couple of years and then return to school to earn a master's degree in library science to pursue a career as a librarian. Evangeline Moore was unable to come home to Mims for Christmas, but had arranged to visit her family 2 days later. She did not hear about the bombing of her house until she arrived. I left Washington, D.C. about 7 o'clock in the morning of December 27th. I boarded the train, the Silver Meteor, came all the way down to Titusville, and when I got off the train in Titusville, I knew that something was very, very wrong. They wouldn't call me, and unfortunately, I had not turned on radio or television, so I didn't know a thing about it until I got off the train. I noticed that my mother and father were not in front of all my relatives to greet me, and they were always there. So after I greeted all of my relatives, and my Uncle George was on leave from Korea, we got into his car and settled, and the first thing I asked was, well, where's Mom and Dad? No one said anything for a while. It was complete silence. Finally, Uncle George turned around and he said, well, Van, I guess I'm the one who has to tell you. Your house was bombed Christmas night, your dad's dead, and your mother's in the hospital. That's the way I found out. I've never gotten over it. It was unbelievable. I remember telling them, I don't believe my daddy is dead and I won't believe it until I see him. Well, after we left the train station, we did stop by our house, and I took one look at that, and I never went back. And then they went by the funeral home in Sanford, Florida, and I was told that my dad had not been embalmed and I couldn't see him. So during that first few days I was there, I said, no, he's not dead. He can't be dead. That's my daddy. So we spent a lot of time at the hospital with my mom. The doctor had given her 9 days to live and said if she made it past the 9th day, she would be okay. Well, she died on the afternoon of the 9th day. Although Evangeline Moore had not heard about it, the murder of Harry T. Moore was international news the next day and was the subject of front-page headlines and newspaper editorials around the world. Civil rights leaders, both black and white, protested the murder and called for improved race relations. Ironically, Harry T. Moore and his efforts would soon be forgotten. The beginning of the modern civil rights movement in America is generally considered to be the Brown v. Board of Education decision that declared segregation was unconstitutional. Since Moore was assassinated in 1951, his legacy is often overlooked. Even the Granite Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, which lists the names of slain leaders such as Medgar Evers, Viola Liuzzo, Martin Luther King, and 37 others, excludes the name of Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore. While the memory of the Moores is being honored in Central Florida, however, with the Moore Cultural Complex and the annual Moore Heritage Festival of the Arts and Humanities. And of course, over the past decades, things have gotten a little bit better. There is now a replica of the Moore family home at the Moore Cultural Complex in Mims. And Evangeline Moore comes back every December for a ceremony honoring her parents and is very happy to see the replica built. And she said she never returned to the property after that first day. It took her many decades, but now she's very happy to go into the replica and remember happier times in the replica home with her family. Thank you.
As is the case with others of our authors this evening, there are some of them have their books on those tables, and they will be on sale and available for signing later. And here is Dr. Brotmarkle's book that he referenced. Weona Cleveland, as you know, is unable to be with us tonight, but it won't surprise those of you who know her that she was especially looking forward to this because she wanted to meet Joni Sherm. She told me on the phone. Weona interviewed Dr. Holzer back in the day, I'm sure you know the time period, and had read Joni's book when I called her to talk about this event. So this evening, playing the part of the honorary Brevard County historian, Weona Cleveland, is Ben Brotmarkle.
Well, I'm very happy to fill in for Weona this evening. The Florida Historical Society Press proudly published the book Mosquito Soup last year, which is a compilation of many years of work. Over 30 years, Weona Cleveland wrote for local newspapers, including Florida Today, and so I kind of feel like I'm walking in her footsteps. I have a weekly column that runs in Florida Today every Tuesday on Florida history and culture, but she did that for 30 years with Melbourne Times and Florida Today, so I'm very happy to be able to read a selection from Mosquito Soup that was one of her articles. Here recently in the Melbourne area, there's been a lot of talk about historic preservation and historic buildings that need to be saved, and Melbourne High School is the latest one, the 1926 historic high school. There's a lot of talk about that, and the school board is meeting on Tuesday to decide the fate of that historic structure. Green Gables is another one, and I know there's a lot of people here this evening from the South Brevard Historical Society. Carol and Carl Andren among them, who have worked to save Green Gables. So I want to read a section of this book that looks at Green Gables by Weona Cleveland. From the veranda of the house on the bluff, Stanford Wells would focus his binoculars on the sailboats on the Indian River. Sometimes he would watch the vessels of the Brown Boat Line heading toward the Melbourne harbor. Perhaps he would scan the horizon, watching the gulls and pelicans. Stanford enjoyed nature. He was now in his early 50s. He was a bachelor. He had come back here to the house his parents called Green Gables after nearly a half-century of adventure. He had an engineering degree. It is believed that he graduated from Cornell University. He had traveled Europe. He had climbed the Matterhorn. During World War I, he was an engineer or on a steamer, says his step-grandson Michael Kraft. Kraft thinks Stanford may have been in the Merchant Marines and after the war went to the Northwest where he was employed in the logging industry. But as he stood on the veranda of Green Gables in the early 1930s, did Stanford Wells remember those first years in the hamlet of Melbourne when there were about 100 inhabitants and his house of Queen Anne-style architecture was the showplace of the community? Of course, everyone in the village considered the house way out of town, but William Twining Wells, Stanford's father, knew what he wanted. He had a vision. W.T. Wells, a graduate of Columbia University, was the owner of the Rustless Iron Company in New Jersey. His wife, Nora Stanford Wells, was a graduate of Elmira College and the daughter of Charles Stanford, a New York State senator. Her uncle had been the Civil War governor of California and the founder of Stanford University. Although she was just 39 years old when she and her husband first saw Melbourne, Nora Wells suffered from severe attacks of pneumonia. She had just recovered from such an attack when they came to Florida in 1894. Wells himself suffered from neuralgia. They made a tour of the state and chose Melbourne as their future home. Wells later would record that Melbourne has natural advantages and a very enjoyable society. Shortly after celebrating his 42nd birthday, Wells purchased 174 acres of land in Melbourne and signed a contract with Baker and Bell to build a house on the bluff overlooking the Indian River. Neer and Taylor was the company which put down an artesian well. Construction began in 1896 while the Wells family was at its summer home at Lake George, New York. The artesian well may have powered a hydroelectric generator which provided electricity to the house. A recent inspection of Green Gables by an architectural engineer showed that the wiring in the house is original, put there when the house was built, although the town of Melbourne did not get electricity until 1913. Green Gables also had indoor plumbing and reportedly the first bathtub in Melbourne. By late October 1896, the house was completed. The Wells family, including daughter Gladys and sons Stanford and Prescott, moved in. Stanford was 15 years old that year. Hardly a month had elapsed when W.T. Wells began talking about putting a shell road between Melbourne and O'Galley, presumably along the riverfront. The Wells family owned 2 fine horses and had a carriage. They enjoyed driving about the countryside. Before the Wells family returned to the Lake George home in the spring of 1897, W.T. Wells was organizing the East Coast Chautauqua, a movement popular around the turn of the century, which sponsored educational programs featuring lectures, music, drama, and readings. The idea had originated at Chautauqua, New York, and now was spreading throughout the country. Touring companies took those programs to rural and small-town America. Wells rarely let any grass grow beneath his feet. He was always improving, organizing, donating, agitating, and proposing. He was creative and generous. In addition to the Chautauqua, Wells had proposed another idea that spring of 1897. Holy Trinity Episcopal Church was located on the south side of Crane Creek, but the vast majority of its parishioners lived on the north side of the creek. Wells attended Holy Trinity, and he suggested that the church be moved to the north side. He offered land for the church, which was dismantled, barged across the creek, and rebuilt at what is now the corner of Fee Avenue and US 1. When the Wells family returned to Melbourne in the autumn of 1897, they brought with them a Professor Harry Winters to run the local high school. There was no high school building, so Wells had one erected. It was called Educational Hall, located on what was to become the Dixie Highway, now US 1, across the street from what would later be the ice plant. Wells employed local men to maintain the grounds of Green Gables, planting trees and shrubs. It is believed by Michael Kraft that the miniature bamboo growing on the property today may have been one of the original plantings. Wells is known to have planted shade trees, but many of the large oaks on the property may have been there long before he bought the land. Kraft believes many of the oaks are well over 100 years old. Wells purchased land on Front Street, owned several rental cottages around town, and bought land in the area of Malabar and on the Barrier Island, where he started a pineapple plantation. Dan McCarty from Ancona set out the 6,500 pineapple slips on the 12 acres on the Barrier Island. McCarty's son would later become governor of Florida. By 1902, all of the Wells children were in college. Gladys attended Wellesley. By 1903, Stanford had graduated from college and may have lived briefly in Jacksonville. In the meantime, W.T. Wells had become even more active in the Chautauqua movement. In 1902, he built an auditorium to provide a proper meeting place for the programs. The auditorium, which seated 1,000 people, was located north and slightly west of what today is the intersection of Fee Avenue and Waverly Place. At the age of 49 in 1903, W.T. Wells was still building empires, still full of pioneering schemes. He, along with several other men, incorporated the Central Florida and Indian River Railroad, which was to run through a section of Brevard, Osceola, Polk, and Orange counties, connecting the town of Malabar with Orlando. From Green Gables, William Twining, Wells had dreamed many dreams, perhaps had experienced some sorrows, and surely had experienced much joy. His children had grown into adulthood here. In 1915, Wells offered the city of Melbourne land for a park. The city didn't accept the property because there were no funds in the budget to develop it. Wells made the offer 3 more times, 1921, 1924, and 1927, before the city accepted and began what today is the 30-acre Wells Park in the heart of the city. In 1917, the lives of the Wells family and a family named Lyman began to draw together. The Lymans had been in Melbourne since 1885. Austin Lyman was a dentist and prominent member of the Congregational Church. After some time away from Melbourne, Austin's son, Louis A. Lyman, returned to the community, bringing his wife Pearl and 2 daughters with him. In 1918, Pearl Lyman started the first library in Melbourne. At first, it was a roving library, but when the first permanent structure was built on Strawbridge Avenue, W.T. Wells was the overseer and Nora Wells was responsible for obtaining the interior furnishings. In 1921, Pearl Lyman gave birth to her 3rd daughter, Catherine. She continued to be the library director, a job she held until she resigned in 1953. In 1930, W.T. Wells died at Green Gables. He was 75 years old. Nora Wells died in early October 1933 while visiting her daughter Gladys in Fort Dodge, Iowa. Later that same month, in Melbourne, Louis Lyman, Pearl's husband, just 58 years old, died at his home on Melbourne Avenue. In April 1934, bachelor Stanford Wells and widow Pearl Lyman were married at the Congregational Church. Only daughter Catherine, then 13 years old, was still living at home. Catherine called her stepfather Stanny. The name was eventually used by Stanford's stepchildren, one of whom is Michael Kraft, Catherine's son. Kraft remembers, Stanny was the salt of the earth. He was about 5 feet 10 inches, had huge hands. He liked nature and solitude. He belonged to the Melbourne Hunting Club and would take us, the grandchildren, out to Deer Park where he would teach us about nature. He liked to hunt, and I remember he had the heads, feet, and beards of turkeys tacked to the walls of his shop. There was the hide of a bobcat tacked to the door. Whenever he went to the woods, he would always bring back flowers for Pearl. Green Gables stands silent and empty now. The sounds of Gladys's guitar and the music of Pearl's piano are stilled. The house has stood its ground against many hurricanes. Quietly, it still stands against the winds of change. And obviously that's still true.
Scott Tilley may require you at first to sort of switch the sides of your brain, but soon you will see that he adds an essential human touch to his high-tech topics. Formerly of our College of Engineering and College of Business, he now directs our computing education program in the College of Science. In his biographical sketch, you'll see that he has published a number of books and his weekly column in the Florida Today, which is called Technology Today. So, Scott.
Well, thank you again for hosting and organizing this great event. It was mentioned earlier the difficulty in selecting things to read. I'm picking from columns, so I literally have hundreds to pick from. So I've chosen 3. I've collected them and published them by year, and I have very inventive names for them. For example, Technology 2014. I've picked 3, and I think they are timely and relevant, and they're kind of special to me. The first one, I have to say, given that I have an actual astronaut sitting beside me, I feel a little bit intimidated. It's from 2011. And I should say that I'm going to give you 3 titles. Because if you read the columns in the newspaper, if you like the headline, then I did it. If you don't like it, I didn't do it. Because actually, I don't set the headlines. I just give them a subject and an indication of what I might like. So for example, today's column was about hacking cars. And I probably wouldn't have called it, "Hey dude, where's my car?" But that's what the headline was. So this was from July 9th, 2011. And if you think back what was happening then, it was shuttle time, sort of the sunset of the shuttle program. And this is actually one of the few articles that I wrote that became a centerpiece, which means it's filled the whole page and they had quite a few photographs and so on. And I called it "How the Space Shuttle Influenced Me." And the subject or the subtitle was "Space Program's Effect Ripples Through Memory, Life, Career." It was published as "A Life Affected." So July 9th, 2011. Everyone on the Space Coast has their own story of how the space program has influenced their life. My story begins in 1969. I was just 5 at the time, but I can still remember running home to watch the Apollo astronauts take their first steps on the moon. The TV was an old black and white model, but that didn't detract from the excitement I felt watching live shots from space. It's a testament to how deeply this moment affected me that I can still recall it quite clearly today. In elementary school and high school, I had several assignments related to space. I often turned to NASA for help, and they obliged every time. I was so excited to receive large envelopes with their blue logo in the mail. I felt as if I, too, was part of the space program. There's no doubt that these projects influenced my career choice to pursue computers and technology. Fast forward to 1986. Like millions of people, I watched the Challenger disaster live on TV. I can recall this moment in time, too. I was dumbfounded and didn't believe it was really happening. Sadly, it was. I wondered how to build incredibly complex devices like the shuttle so that they could be safer and more reliable. I still focus on this topic in my software engineering research. I moved to Florida in early 2003. Shortly after I arrived, I was again glued to the TV, watching aghast as Columbia broke up during re-entry over Texas. Columbia's launch was the first shuttle that I had seen live from the beach. This one felt personal. When Discovery made the return to flight in 2005, I also watched it live. It was spectacular. I felt the rumble of the engines during launch. I've witnessed flames light up the sky for nighttime launches. I've heard the twin sonic booms as the orbiter hurtles across central Florida. I've seen the shuttle fly back, piggyback on a 747 as it returned home from California. These are all wonderful memories. We all know about how many technology spin-offs from the space program that have benefited us. I think it's been a wise investment. But the space program is about more than just business and technology. It represents the culmination of President Kennedy's grand vision. It truly brings out the best in us. It inspired me as a child, and it still does today. I don't know what will happen when Atlantis is finally retired and the space shuttle's 30-year program ends. I just hope that we don't lose sight of the big picture. Space is a vacuum, and if we're not filling it by taking the lead in space, someone else will. It really is rocket science, and it's a wonderful thing. I pass? All right. Okay, that was the big one out of the way. The second one is from 2013, and it's also timely. Now, at the time, this was published November 1st, 2013. And at the time, I was teaching a course on cyber ethics, and I was also teaching a class on software engineering. And cyber ethics, if you're not familiar with the term, it's a study of ethics in society and how technology affects it and how decisions made from technology can affect public policy in our lives. And the topic I'm going to read to you today was basically the gift that just kept giving from a story point of view. It's called healthcare.gov. And the subtitle was, "A Scary Prospect Just in Time for Halloween." It was published as "Bungled Launch of ACA Website is No Surprise." Just in time for Halloween comes something so scary you want to run screaming into the night. An ominous phrase so full of foreboding that you know something bad will happen. It's enough to send chills down your spine. We're from the government, and we're here to help. This month's sad display of government technical ineptitude with the rollout of healthcare.gov website should come as no surprise to anyone. Our elected and appointed officials have a long history of botched IT projects stretching back decades, and it never seems to get any better. Just before I joined Carnegie Mellon University and the Software Engineering Institute in 1995, colleagues from the SCI and MIT were asked to perform an assessment of the FAA's floundering upgrade program. It was years late and billions of tax dollars over budget. Lessons learned from this fiasco are well documented and widely publicized, but apparently never reached Washington. The literature is full of similar doomed efforts, such as the Denver Airport baggage handling system and the FBI's virtual case file project. Failures at this scale are one of the reasons the SCI created the Capability Maturity Model, or CMM, to help determine a contractor's ability to deliver the software they promised, on time and on budget. Fast forward nearly 20 years, and we have the world's superpower demonstrating its inability to get a website up and running properly. It's so bad that Saturday Night Live opened their show last week with a masterful skit featuring Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius apologizing for the website and offering, quote, helpful hints to get around the bugs, such as, quote, have you tried restarting your computer? The skit ended with an offer from the government to send you a copy of Encarta 95 and a disk from AOL to get you online using a dial-up modem. It cracked me up because it's so close to the truth. The government's official response to the Affordable Care Act's website's ills were to institute a, quote, tech surge. I'm sure the uninformed thinking was that if it worked in Iraq, it should work online too. Sadly, the opposite is true, and it's been known for nearly 30 years. In 1975, Fred Brooks published his seminal book called The Mythical Man Month, which contained many principles of software engineering gleaned from his own extensive experiences in the field. One such principle was, quote, adding manpower to a late software project makes it later. It's too bad Three Stooges Development LLC or whoever else was responsible for the healthcare.gov website hadn't read it. Now, if you follow the news, healthcare.gov was in the news again today. 800,000 false or incorrect tax returns. So the people who are hoping to get early filing, not so much. I haven't checked my mail. I don't know if I've got one or not yet. The last piece is from, again, appropriately titled Technology 2014, so that's from last year. And I picked an article that is related to the library and related to technology that's completely changing the nature of publishing these days. And I called it Kindle eBooks. The subtitle was Back to the Future with Self-Publishing, and it was published as Kindle Turns Self-Publishing on Its Head. This was published January 24th, 2014. At the end of 2013, Amazon.com reported that nearly 25% of the top 100 Kindle ebooks are from independent publishers. The phrase, quote, independent publisher is a euphemism for self-published authors who have chosen to bypass the traditional publishing process and sell their writing directly to their readers. In the past, we have called this sort of publishing vanity press. As the word vanity suggests, it's usually seen as unprofessional. Only authors who had their work rejected by, quote, real publishers would resort to publishing their own work. Implicit with self-published books was the assumption that the writing was of low quality, and the expectation was that there was only a very small market for the book, typically limited to the author's immediate circle of family and friends. Technology has changed all that. Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing Program, or KDP, has given thousands of authors the opportunity to publish their book their way. Programs like KDP are accelerating disintermediation in the publishing world, and this is having a tremendous impact on the marketplace. Self-publishing is nothing new. Some very famous authors self-published their books, including Mark Twain, T.S. Eliot, and Edgar Allan Poe. What has changed is the way the books are created and distributed. In the past, self-published books still had to be printed and distributed to stores, which was very expensive for independent authors. Today, ebooks are digital, which means there's almost no cost for distribution. The KDP program takes care of the entire process, from uploading your book in Word format to converting it to a Kindle ebook to placing it on Amazon.com's website for the world to buy. In addition to increased control over their work, self-published ebook authors can enjoy significantly more financial success than most authors who go with the traditional publishing path. For example, the KDP program gives authors 70% of the royalties from the sales of their books. This is significantly more than the usual 10% royalty fee paid by traditional publishers. I'll have to have a talk with my publisher afterwards. Last year, the book 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James became the fastest selling book ever. It sold 70 million copies in the US alone. This book was first published as an ebook, self-published as an ebook. The author is reported to have earned over $95 million, making her the highest paid writer in the business, surpassing even J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter fame. This level of success may not be typical, but the technology has put it in reach for more authors than ever before. The ebook market is huge and growing. You only need a small slice of the pie to dine well. Thank you.
Thank you too, Scott, for giving us the opportunity to mention that we have 170,000 ebooks in our collection at the Evans Library. Marcia Denius continues to contribute to academic pursuits here at Florida Tech, but she will be quick to tell you that she has found a great gift in her retirement, and that is time. Time for long walks on the beach, time for writing poems and reading books at leisure, time for relaxing with family, as evidenced here tonight, and best of all, time for awakening more fully to the world's amazing everyday wonders and mysteries. As she says, that's poetry's mother lode. One of her poems comes from the 2010 collaboration between 12 nationally published poets and 12 visual artists that resulted in an exhibition at the Brevard Art Museum. So let's hear from Marcia.
Thank you, Kathy. It's an honor to be here tonight, and I've enjoyed all the readings thus far. And Scott Tilley's, I always read your column because I hope to glean something that will make me a little bit more fluent in technology, because I'm really not right now. And I actually tore out the column that you wrote last for Valentine's Day. Yes, and this is how he ends it. I read a recent news report from ABC that said, "Who needs cards to express your love? Nearly 50% of us will send all of our Valentine wishes electronically." Don't be in that 50%. Take the effort to send a proper Valentine's Day wish. Get a printed card and write your message by hand inside. Buy flowers that actually smell, not just a rose app that displays an image of a fake bouquet. If you want to use technology to help you find the perfect gift, that's great. Just don't give technology as the gift. Real life is precious. Savor it this Valentine's Day. Disconnect and focus on what's important. I loved it. Thank you. Okay, I'll read just two poems tonight. The first is from my book, Sweet Surrender, and most of the poems in the collection have coastal Florida as their triggering subject. And the poem, Casting Out, that I'll read, recalls some of the times I spent fishing with my sons when they were younger. For this poem, I imagined a mangrove island on the riverside of Sebastian Inlet. Casting out. In russet blue shallows, he stands rock still, poised to catch shadow or flash. On shore, I watch through the black branches of mangroves, silent as my son has requested. How different from when he was younger, yelling over the noise of the breakers. We fished for blues and kept our catch. His body tenses. Small rings dance on the surface as he eyes his dangling line and the mayfly he's tied with feathers and threads from his grandfather's box. He steps out heron-like, long legs striding, muddy bare feet, and a back-facing ball cap. Not a ripple. He flicks his wrist, releases the line in an S. From some skeletal pine, an osprey's raptor cry catches in my throat. The fly skims the surface, skips back as his arms mimic the rising trout's fins. The hook set, he mends the line and seems to bow to the zigzagging quicksilver. He scoops the fish up, thrashing in brackish call, spins round to show me, removing the hook. Together we watch the fish shoot away, and the osprey circles overhead. The other poem that I'll read is from this beautiful book published by the Brevard Art Museum. It's a culmination of a project between artists and poets, as Kathy has mentioned, visual artists. And the idea, the title is Transformations. And the book is the culmination of a many months long collaboration. And Dr. Skellings was the honorary chairman, the Poet Laureate of Florida, ably assisted by Diane Newman, of this project. And the idea was, let's see what happens if we get two creative people together who work in different media and let them get to know one another and discuss how they create, and then look at if this changes, if there's any sort of a transformation in the way the art is done. And as expected by those who conceived the idea, an exciting transformation in the creative processes did occur in the works of all 12 pairs of artists. I was paired with Ellen Lindner, an award-winning quilter. After meeting together several times to talk about our inspirations and creative processes for our respective works, we decided that transitions would be the initiating subject for the quilt and the poem. She created a gorgeous quilt of flowers in various stages of bloom, and I wrote about clouds. Divining the clouds. The only thing certain about clouds is change. A ceaseless stitching and unstitching creates their colors and their shapes, as fabrics or words do in a quilt or a poem. Watching the clouds is like watching a movie without a script. A lion crouching turns into an angel and disappears. Thunderheads like mountains grow and shift. Their heft suggests huge rocks that float in the skies of Rene Magritte. Clouds are changelings, shapeshifters, titans of transition. Kaleidoscopic, they fearlessly forge new connections, but to take it all in, I, not the lens, must spin in a slow, full circle, eyes wide open, making me feel dizzy and small. Their milieu so vast it's beyond my grasp and ken. Rising from the horizon, ragged edges merge and limn the sky. their measure as infinite as that of the coastline of Britain. Beguiled, I look to them for a sign, try to decipher meaning from the syllables of mist and dust. Such folly. Then turn to the metaphors, copious in their convergence, and I am transported to a country where anything's possible, which frees me from all that I think I know. I keep looking skyward, drawn in by the mystery, though aware that cloud gazers are often thought daft, like Hamlet or Antony. Unhinged as our lives, they cannot be relied on. They'll promise sun, but surprise with rain. So fickle their vow may be broken by the faraway flit of a butterfly's wing. Yet the cloud's whimsical nature belies their power. Airy reliquaries of fire and water, they shroud the glare of blazing truth, of the absolute. While like the old gods, they vex, meting out their favor or fury from afar, the domain where the world computes. From here, I watch the setting sun ignite a mackerel sky, fill it full of tropical fish scaling the upper reaches. And on that sky shore is the place I long to reach, the cloud of unknowing, the still point, where I can lose myself in a final transition in a union so seamless, neither stitching nor words are needed. Thank you.
I'm somewhat amazed by the connections and the interconnections among all of these readers. This is quite fascinating. Andrew Aberdeen currently serves as president of the Florida Philosophical Association. Tonight he brings a combination of both his academic interests and his long-time passion as he reads from a book, about a book, that was one whose purpose, one of its purposes, was to introduce philosophy. Such was the case when a 10-year-old Andrew was introduced to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which in turn introduced him to philosophy, which in turn shaped his career. I'm familiar with some of those philosophy and books, and I really look forward to hearing about this one.
Thank you, Kathy, for that generous introduction. And I'm very honoured to be invited to this splendid evening and to see such an impressive audience. The philosophers these days tend to write mostly for other philosophers, which I really don't want to criticise. I mean, that's mostly the sort of philosophy that I write. But it is nice occasionally to write for a wider audience. One of the opportunities that we get to do this is, well, thanks to discovery that some publishers made a few years ago that there was money in philosophy and pop culture. And there are now something like 5 different publishers with various series on pop culture topics and philosophy. And some of these are pretty far-fetched. I mean, I must admit that I've not read Led Zeppelin and philosophy. For all I know, that the authors found rich philosophical themes to discuss, but I take that on trust. But I've contributed to a few of these myself, and in particular, the one I was delighted to be invited to contribute to was this book edited by Nick Joel, who teaches in the UK, on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in philosophy, because, well, yes, as Kathy just told you, I mean, my own introduction to philosophy, really, before I even knew that it was philosophy, before I'd heard of philosophy as an academic discipline, was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was hugely popular in the UK as a radio series, and then as a novel, and then as a TV series. Much later, it came out as a not very good film, which some of you may have seen, but it was certainly my inspiration in philosophy. So, well, I have a longish essay in this, which I shan't read all of it, but I shall read some of it. Of course, if you've never heard of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, then some of this may be incongruous, but there we go. Let's see how it goes. So my title of my essay, I'm not going to read all of it, as I say. I'll give you a couple of sections, but the title was The Judo Principle Philosophical Method on the Logic of Jokes. As early as the second episode of the original radio series of Hitchhikers, Douglas Adams wrote himself into a corner. He had arranged for Arthur and Ford to escape the destruction of the Earth on board one of the Vogon ships responsible for that destruction. There they were safe, as Arthur observes, only in a usage of that word he wasn't previously aware of. They are duly expelled from the Vogon ship into the vacuum of space with no form of life support. This is fiction, of course, and I'm speaking immediately in front of an astronaut who I'm sure is well aware just how fictional this concept is. A predicament from which any escape seems utterly improbable. That left Adams in a bind. All the solutions he could come up with seemed like cheating. And as he wrote in notes accompanying the published radio scripts, there's no point making a big song and dance about what a terrible predicament your characters are in if you just cheat your way out of it. But watching a documentary on judo, he had a breakthrough. If you have a problem, the trick is to use this problem to solve itself. Let us call this trick the judo principle. In accordance with the judo principle, Adams used the problem of improbability against itself by making the improbability of Arthur and Ford's rescue the means of their rescue. The infinite improbability drive did not just get Adams out of this particular bind, it licensed all the coincidences that litter the rest of the complex and divergent narratives of the Hitchhiker's sequence. I mean, of course, again, I'm writing for an audience of people who know the stuff backwards. For those of you who don't know the stuff backwards, what happens is that a split second after they're thrown into the vacuum of space, they encounter a ship powered by the infinite improbability drive, which, with infinite improbability, brings them back on board the ship. Hence the rescue. So their rescue from their improbable rescue is brought about by improbability. The judo principle is also naturally enough echoed in the description of how the drive was invented. Apparently, physicists had long since cracked the problem of generating finite amounts of improbability from a strong Brownian motion producer, say a nice hot cup of tea, but have little success in scaling up this work to produce an infinite improbability drive capable of interstellar travel until one student has a breakthrough. Such a machine is a virtual impossibility. So it must logically be a finite improbability. So all I have to do in order to make one is to work out exactly how improbable it is, feed that figure into the finite improbability generator, give it a fresh cup of really hot tea, and turn it on. The infinite improbability drive then pops into existence as if by magic. Indeed, the drive is essentially magical. It bears little relationship to anything we know about infinity, improbability, Brownian motion, or indeed tea. However, the judo principle, which led to its discovery, the use of problems to solve themselves, turns out to have a very important place in philosophical methodology. This chapter will explore how the judo principle works through discussion of some of the specific uses philosophers have made of it, each of which also attracted Douglas Adams' attention. The definition of infinity, the foundations of knowledge, artificial intelligence, and parallel worlds. I will discuss each of these ideas in turn. No, I won't. I will discuss one of these ideas, the foundations of knowledge. Since ancient Greece, philosophers have been much concerned with the nature of knowledge. In ordinary talk, we often claim to know things, but we also often discover that we're wrong, and therefore that we don't really know what we thought we knew. But what is it that distinguishes real knowledge from false knowledge claims? This turns out to be a difficult question to answer satisfactorily, but the judo principle has given rise to two very different solutions. Some philosophers turned the difficulty of identifying knowledge against itself in a simple way, concluding that knowledge can't be had, and that we should just learn to be happy with our ignorance. These were the original skeptics, a school inspired by Pyrrho of Elis, 4th, 3rd century BC. Due to his influence, skepticism of this uncompromising nature is called Pyrrhonian skepticism. Adams gives us a textbook Pyrrhonian skeptic in the person of the man in the shack, who provides the anticlimax to protracted quest in the book to discover who really rules the universe. We never learn any other name for the man in the shack. Indeed, he is so committed to skepticism that he is uncertain whether he has or needs a name. I don't know. Why do you think I should have one? It seems very odd to give a bundle of vague sensory perceptions a name. Just as Perrault predicted, however, this radical skepticism seems to have made the man in the shack happy. Despite his meagre circumstances and great responsibilities, he exudes ataraxia, or freedom from care, the peace of mind which Perrault and his school claim to follow from the determined avoidance of having an opinion about anything. This radical disinterestedness also makes him the perfect solution to a political paradox which Douglas Adams observes. Those people who most want to rule people are, ipso facto, those least suited to do it. The man in the shack so little wants to rule people that he's not even convinced that he actually does rule people. The characters in the story conclude that the universe is in pretty good hands. This passage has lent itself to some tenuous interpretation. Some people have seen it as evidence of Adams' implicit commitment to political libertarianism. Others assume that the man in the shack is a representation of God. Nonetheless, for ordinary mortals with no universe to rule, Perronian skepticism is not a very attractive position. Understandably, many philosophers have sought more definite answers. René Descartes' answer to the problem of making knowledge secure took the form of a new, more sophisticated application of the Judo principle. His argument is famously known as the cogito, from its formulation in Latin. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes concludes that whatever else he may be wrong about, he cannot deny his own existence. So that is one thing of which he can be certain. That much was not original. Aristotle and Augustine had reasoned in a similar fashion many centuries earlier. But Descartes didn't stop there. He proceeded to argue that the whole structure of knowledge could be re-established on this indubitable foundation. Skepticism is thus a procedure to demolish everything completely, start again right from the foundations. But rather than content himself with a shack, Descartes believes he can construct a palace, a prodigious, rational edifice, ultimately encompassing all of science. The cogito finds a place in Hitchhikers 2 in the ruminations of the supercomputer Deep Thought, which was so amazingly intelligent that even before its databanks had been connected up, it had started from I think, therefore I am, and got as far as deducing the existence of rice pudding and income tax before anyone managed to turn it off. Descartes was particularly concerned with the reliability of ideas that he owed to his senses, ideas which would come to be known as a posteriori, contrasted with a priori, ideas which may be known independently of the senses. He eventually concluded that his a posteriori knowledge was by and large reliable by appealing to the existence of God, something he believed he could deduce a priori, since God would not permit him to be systematically deceived by his senses. Since Deep Thought's databanks have not been connected, a priori reasoning would seem to be the only variety available to it. Hence, Deep Thought goes one better than Descartes by deducing the existence of such ostensibly a posteriori phenomena as rice pudding and income tax from wholly a priori grounds. And, well, I'll conclude with my footnote that this is, of course, impossible. It should be said, however, that rice pudding seems to pose the greater challenge. With no knowledge of the external world, how could one even suspect the existence of rice or puddings, let alone that one may be made from the other? Income tax has a more baleful inevitability. It must be at least conceivable, given some very rudimentary, although still a posteriori, assumptions about economics. Thank you very much.
It's recurring themes throughout this evening. I'm just delighted that these readers and all of you have made a path to the Evans Library. I'm astounded at some of the connections here. One of our favorite visitors here is Louise Skellings, and that's for a variety of reasons. From her biographical sketch, you can tell that she is a fascinating woman as an accomplished practitioner of Taekwondo, Aikido, and Tai Chi, as a private pilot, as a seasoned traveler, and a writer in her own right. The Evans Library, the home of the Edmund Skellings Digital Archive Collection, is honored to have Louise read to us from the work of her late husband, Florida's Poet Laureate from 1980 to 2012, and the electronic poet, Dr. Ed Skellings. So let's hear from Louise.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank all of you so much for being here. I am really grateful to have the opportunity to present some of Ed's poems, and I'm even more grateful to Florida Tech for housing the collection and the fact that all of you could go online and hear Ed read his own poems, because all of them are on there. If you just Google Edmund Skellings collection, I won't bother with the address. The first poem that I'd like to read shows what Kathy's been talking about, all the connections, because this poem was written on the occasion of Valentine's Day, which has come up several times. And Jody mentioned it's hard to write a humorous poem or a love poem, and this is a humorous love poem. But I originally chose it because it's addressed to me, and I thought maybe that would legitimize me reading somebody else's work. So, Louise, you found the secret side of me, inside the pride of me, under the hide of me. You are the time of my life, the rhyme of my life, the I'm of my life. You make the past passive, the present tense, the future perfect. You keep my kitchen clean, run my sewing and my washing machine. You are the heart of me. You make my money, honey, comedy funny. You are the Easter bunny. You are the art of me. That poem is not actually in collected poems. No. This poem it's called Ages, and it's one of Ed's science poems. He started out as a chemistry major, actually, and then after he served in the Army for 3 years, he came back and thought literature was his first love, and he wanted to be a writer. But he never lost his interest in science, and he was very interested in string theory and DNA and everything about the moon, and he has poems about virtually every area of science. This one, we were on a cruise, and he was reading a book. I thought it was called The Right-Handed Universe, but when I looked online, I could not find any book called that, so maybe that wasn't what it was called, but that's what it was about, whether the universe is right or left-handed. And it included studies from Louis Pasteur's crystal experiments, which you can find a lot about online. It's called Ages. It was Louis Pasteur, I believe, who wasted almost a year with his eye to a powerful lens trained on a little dish. With a needle, he moved a powder, all the right-handed crystals left, all the left-handed crystals right, 2 tiny teaspoons of crystals. Imagine him there, scarcely breathing, not a feather of wind in the room, teasing his crystals with needles into 2 tiny peaks on the dish. It took him almost a year, student Pasteur with his needles. And then, of course, the announcement, which, of course, no one waited for. All living crystals are right-handed crystals, and right-handed crystals only. The rest of the universe mixes its crystals. Life is right-handed, right-handed. The experiment now is buried under the dust of the thousands of long, dull laboratory hours, most of them yielding no answers, or what is worse, no questions. It's all a matter of finding or not finding. No one remembers the aching neck of young Louis, holding his breath in a room, holding his fingers so steady, in an age when we say life was slower. And the last poem I'd like to read is appropriately called Farewell Address. Florida is my farewell address, and just about everyone else's. Some days it seems as if we're all lined up here for departures of various sorts, waiting for the great cruise ship, all stacked up at the last jet port, patient for the smiling man at customs. A few words are in order, a speech at the ribbon, a last wave from the top of the stairs, a few final smiles for the flashbulbs. My theme is the great poem in the skull. We are all working on it in various stages of completion. My great poem in the skull contains many should-haves, especially many should-have-saids. And it also has many good lines which don't fit, but which I fully intend to use sometime later at exactly the appropriate moment. And my great poem in the skull has loads of plans, but finds execution difficult. And you'll notice there are a few rhymes in mine, and that I have chosen a rambling style. Not that there isn't a sonnet included here and there, but I just can't make the sonnet last more than 14 lines, which may be poignant, but never gets you from sunrise to sunset. And speaking of dreams, you won't find any here, except for the one about Sherlock Holmes in a field full of sheep made out of stone, which I mention because they keep coming up in my great poem in the skull, though not with any mathematical precision, and you could even say that waking up in a great sweat makes one sort of stanza or natural division. And the great poem in the skull has been going on as long as I can remember, with the early parts full of childhood faces, ball games, imitation battles, and the middle parts are full of long studies and short loves, and enough prurient interest to satisfy the trade. Though because this is a farewell address, I will keep to the moment, though an anecdote or a digression is probably not out of order, though. As usual, this is not exactly what I wanted to say. The great thought almost to the tip of the tongue, interrupted by the waitress or the man cutting me off on the highway, simply being too late by an hour, or most often one drink too many. And there are so many ways of not going on with the great poem in the skull. And the women stop you the most. A look, a leg, or that hank of hair that other great poems in the skull have often mentioned. A toothache or a low-flying plane can also take over, though they're nothing compared to a flashing seatbelt warning. So I guess by now you can see how I'm going. Fear's over there, joy's over here, neat stacks of feelings in some semblance of order, some odd memos with no names or dates that don't fit anywhere but can't be discarded. And that's the trouble. Nothing can be discarded, though at times like these I make a brave effort at some sort of coherence for the great poem in the skull, which someday will end before I can...
That's awesome. As many of us know, Winston Scott brings perspectives from a variety of arenas, from military service, from the stage, from academia, and from space. I'm happy to say that I was in the audience when he was awarded the Edwin Franco Goldman Award, the highest honor of the American Bandmasters Association. Now he will share with us from his 2005 book, Astronaut Scott.
Good evening, and thank you very, very much. I'm happy to be here also. I have had a thoroughly enjoyable evening tonight listening to the various authors read to us. Some of them I follow religiously, like Scott Tilley. I read your column this morning about hacking into automobiles. And I also read the column in the Florida Today about the historical perspective and things, but I didn't have until tonight an affiliation, didn't know who did it. So I'm very, very happy to be here. It's a lot of fun. We've had a long evening. It's been a very, very good one. I'm going to try to not prolong it, but to do my part in such a way that you really enjoy it. A little bit about the book before I go on, called Reflections from Earth Orbit. Now, I'm a military guy. I'm Navy pilot by background, musician, and so on. But I always thought I had an interesting story to tell, and when I retired from active duty, I began looking around for a ghost writer to write my story. I have an agency that represents me for speaking engagements. They put me in touch with various ghostwriters. Nobody was interested. Astronauts have books a dime a dozen. How to go to the bathroom in space. This in space. I decided, oh heck, I'll write my own book. And that's exactly what I did, and very, very pleased because I accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. What I try to do in this book is take you into space with me. Get you to feel, to see what it's like to be up there. And while we're there, I reflect back on some of the things that shaped my life as I was growing up and so on. Thus the title, Reflections from Earth Orbit. Now, it's in bite-sized chunks, and they don't have to be read in any particular order. There's something in here for everybody. And what I'm going to do tonight is read just one of the chapters, and they are short. This has to do with my aviation background, so I need you to use your imagination and go along with me. You're inside of the cockpit of a NASA fighter. You have a helmet on your head, you have an oxygen mask, you're underneath the canopy, and you're streaking across the sky at close to Mach 1. But what's really important about this is not so much the flying of the airplane, it's what led up to the flying of this airplane and the teacher that influenced me during my 5th and 6th grade years as a student in Miami. This chapter is called We've Got to Have Arithmetic. Jacksonville Center, NASA 901 checking at flight level 390. I reduced the power on the two J-85 turbojet engines that propelled my T-38 jet aircraft. Once leveling a cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, I allowed the aircraft to accelerate to cruise speed and then set cruise power. Let's see, I thought, fuel flow, approximately 750 pounds per hour per side. That would give me about Mach 0.9, 9/10 of the speed of sound at 39,000 feet. Pretty good. I could see the coast of the Florida Panhandle off to my right side as I made the familiar trip from Kennedy Space Center, the Cape, to Houston, Texas. Although we fly the space shuttle from the Cape in Florida, NASA astronauts live and work in Houston. The Gulf of Mexico below me looked calm. It almost made me believe I could enjoy boating as much as I was enjoying flying myself at flight level 390. But I wasn't fooled. The bright blue water was rimmed to my right by the white of the Florida beaches. There were sailboats below, quiet and small, just specks on the blue carpet of ocean. And pretty soon, I know, I'd be able to see tiny spots on the water that were oil rig platforms. As I approached Houston, oil tankers and fishing trawlers would be plentiful. I could count them if I wanted to as they crawled to their destinations. The sky was beautiful, clear with only an occasional white puffy cloud. I'm glad I was able to take off as early as I did this afternoon, I thought. If I had taken off any later, the hot southern sun would have been lower in the western sky and shining directly into my eyes. Even though my colored helmet visor, the direct sunlight is very uncomfortable. I thought, if I experience an aircraft problem now, I can divert into Eglin Air Force Base. Eglin's weather is good. The weather forecaster predicted winds at 39,000 feet to be out of 270 at 50 knots. That's 50 knots on the nose. That will slow me down, but I should be in good shape fuel-wise. I'll check the computer and calculate it myself just for backup. NASA 901, this is Jacksonville Center. Radar contact at flight level 390. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Jax, I replied. I'd flown this profile so often that I regularly joked that the aircraft could find its own way to and from the Cape. I could fall asleep, and the aircraft, like a faithful guide dog, would take me to the Cape if I asked it to. Or maybe it was more like a homing pigeon, always returning to Houston when I was away and wanted to go home. This, of course, wasn't true, but I did fly this route so often that it would become a little boring if I didn't keep my mind occupied. I was alone on this flight. There was no one in the back seat to keep me company. Mustn't let my mind wander too much while flying, I told myself. Let me double-check my ground speed, I thought. Okay, I'm receiving the signal from Leeville, a ground station directly on my flight path. That simplifies my backup calculations. I'll start a timer and check it again in a moment. A little basic math will help me determine whether or not the computer is accurate. I was always a pretty good math student, even way back in elementary school. I vividly recall the day a teacher unfamiliar to us entered our 5th grade classroom, spoke with our regular classroom teacher, and then called out my name along with the names of several other students. We were to accompany this other teacher, Mr. Franklin Clark, to a different classroom. Mr. Clark led us outside and along the second-story corridor to his classroom. There, he explained to us that we were selected to participate in an accelerated reading and arithmetic program. While our classmates were having math and reading lessons with our regular classroom teacher, our group would have math and reading with Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark was an unusually animated individual. He walked with a fast gait, spoke with great emphasis, and even sang with us with much enthusiasm. Though somewhat shorter than most of the other male teachers at the school, he possessed a larger than average energy level. He was always friendly, almost bubbly, and supportive to his students. Mr. Clark, however, demanded discipline and respect. We mimicked him behind his back. All students mimicked their teachers, but we liked and respected him. He would sometimes threaten us with having to settle any classroom infractions personally with him. He would assume this really serious facial expression and proclaim, "I'm a skinny piece of leather, but I'm well put together." It was difficult for us to conceal our snickering, since he didn't seem nearly as menacing as some of the other male teachers. We were careful, however, to exhibit good behavior while in his presence. Mr. Clark guided us as we explored the concepts of time and speed. Unbeknownst to us at the time, we were also reinforcing our basic arithmetic skills. I recall discussing the concept of a light year. We actually calculated by hand, there were no handheld calculators or classroom computers in those days, the distance that light traveled in 1 year, a light year. We raced against one another to see who could arrive at the answer first, yelling out our answers, tremendously long strings of numbers. Our answers were probably not numerically correct, but accuracy wasn't important within that particular context. What was important was the thought processes involved in understanding the concept of a light year, understanding why this concept is important, and understand the mechanics of making the light year calculations. Oh, I almost forgot. Must calculate my ground speed. Don't want to blindly trust the flight management system computer. Let's see, Leeville is at 78 nautical miles now. That means I traveled approximately 80 nautical miles in 10 minutes. Therefore, I must be making 480 knots ground speed. The FMS computer says 486 knots. Good. The two answers are very close. 480 knots, and with a 1.15 multiplication factor, that's approximately equal to 550 miles per hour. I smiled at myself. Making such mental calculations is not necessary. It's not required by any regulations. In fact, the computer is almost never wrong. These calculations, however, give me that warm and fuzzy feeling, as we say, when the answers match those of computer. Besides, I read while performing mental gymnastics exercises, the mind wards off Alzheimer's. I hope it's true. NASA 901, Jax, you've got traffic at 2 o'clock, 10 miles opposite direction level. Roger that, Jax. 901's looking, I replied. The traffic was another aircraft just slightly to the right of my aircraft's nose. Flight controllers will often give pilots this type of warning call so that they might see each other's aircraft and augment radar separation with visual separation. I called the Jax. 901 has the traffic in sight. I could see a big airliner passing down into the right of my flight path. The blue and white color scheme with a Delta pattern on the tail allowed me to regularly identify the passing aircraft. It was a Delta Airlines jet eastbound, probably headed to Atlanta, Delta's hub. It's nice and quiet here at altitude and a smooth ride to boot, I thought. I hate it when there are thunderstorms all over. It really adds an element of difficulty to the flight when you have to duck and dodge thunderclouds with the associated hail and lightning. Not to mention the fact that you can't see where you're going. You have to depend 100% on your gauges. The onboard color weather radar scope is clear today to my delight. I'm delighted also for the smooth, uninterrupted whine of the flawlessly operating engines. The fuel balance is good, less than 500 pounds split between the right and left tanks. The distribution of fuel inside the aircraft tanks is critical to maintaining the proper balance and control of the aircraft. If the fuel split grew any larger, I'd have to manually balance the fuel. No big deal. I scan the instruments and note that the engine oil temperature, oil pressure, hydraulic systems all look good. The seeming tranquility of the situation belies the fact that I'm slicing through the atmosphere at close to the speed of sound. It feels good. Mr. Clark introduced us to the concept of binary numbers. He talked to us about how our decimal system is based on the value of 10. The binary system on the other side is based on the number 2. I didn't understand until much later just how the binary system is utilized, but we sure did have fun that day in Mr. Clark's class counting in base 2. Mr. Clark taught us many things. He constantly admonished us to answer all questions either verbally or written with a complete sentence. In his class, we read books, we read and wrote poetry, we sang songs and talked about current events. We followed the events surrounding the selection of the original 7 Mercury astronauts in their early space flights. The most valuable lesson he taught us was the importance of perseverance and hard work. He had us memorize a favorite poem by an anonymous author that I can recall even now, some 40 years later. If a task is once begun, never leave it till it's done. Be the labor great or small, do it well or not at all. Now my interpretation was a little different from the author's. I interpret it as be the labor. I like that statement. Don't just do it, be it. Embrace it. Become a part of what you're doing and do it to the best of your ability. This is a valuable lesson for all of us. NASA 901, Jax. Contact Houston Center on frequency 13217. Roger, Jax. 901, switching to Houston, 13217. Okay, I thought, select VHF COM number 1. That's the rectangular cursor around the frequency below. Now select frequency 132.17 and toggle this frequency into the active frequency window. Pause for a few moments to be sure I don't interrupt a radio conversation already in progress, and then Houston Center, NASA 901, with you at flight level 390. After a moment, the reply comes. NASA 901, Houston Center radar contact. Then there was the one particular day in Mr. Clark's room. He was busy as usual, arranging materials for class, placing papers here, a book there, continuously moving. While several of us were gathering, preparing for class, we made light conversation with Mr. Clark. Only half seriously, I said, "Mr. Clark, let's not have arithmetic today. Let's take this period and play softball in the park." Mr. Clark did not pause from his pre-class preparations. He did not even look at me when he answered, but he did answer, softly, with a hint of a smile, and with a conviction in his voice that I can still hear today. "We've got to have arithmetic," he said. Then he repeated for emphasis, "We've got to have arithmetic." NASA 901, descend to and maintain 10,000 feet. Cross 25 miles east of Trinity at 10,000. Roger that, Houston. 901 is out of flight level 390 for 10,000. We'll cross 25 miles east of Trinity at 10,000, I responded. Doing mental math again, I thought. Let's see, Trinity is 75 miles from here. At 8 miles per minute, it'll take me roughly 9 minutes. I need to lose 29,000 feet, approximately over the 9 minutes. A descent rate of 3,000 to 4,000 feet per minute is a good figure to shoot for. Close enough for government work, I quipped to myself. I've seen Mr. Clark only twice since elementary school. I didn't have a chance to talk with him on either occasion. But if I ever do see him again, and if I get just a moment, I'll remind him of that day in his classroom when a certain fifth-grade future astronaut wanted to play softball rather than have arithmetic. I tell him how glad I am that we had arithmetic on that day and on every other school day. I'll simply say, "Mr. Clark, I'm so glad we had arithmetic." And then maybe for emphasis, I'll say it again. "Mr. Clark, I'm really glad we had arithmetic." Thank you.
I would like to thank some of my colleagues as well, Ann Sepri, Linda Kahn, Sohair Wistawi, Angela Taylor, Petra Branova, Jim Bauckham, and Aaron Mahaney, who helped smooth the way for this evening. I would like to thank all of you for coming, and remember, if you would like to be invited to future events at the Evans Library, please give me your email address. And most of all, I would like to thank these readers. We have skimmed the surface of some very deep waters tonight, and I know that we will soon be reading a lot. Thank you very much.
Once again, I'd just like to thank you all, and we would have some, our author will be signing some of the books over here, so I hope you will have an opportunity to get one of these books. Thank you very much. Thank you.